Hi everyone, thanks for joining in today. I'm happy to have Robyn Mundy joining me, the author of Cold Coast. If you can see my copy there, okay. Just want to, before we start off as well, just want to remind people watching that if you ask a question during the Facebook Live, just type it in comments and I can read it out to Robyn. You'll have a chance to win a copy of Cold Coast thanks to Ultimo Press. So, wild places form a big part of Robyn's life and her novels. Robyn has wintered and summered in Antarctica, the setting for her first novel, The Nature of Ice. Her second novel, Wildlight, is set on remote, Matsuka Island, home to Australia's loneliest lighthouse, where she spent 10 months. And for over 20 years, Robyn has worked seasonally as a ship-based tour guide in Svalbard, Greenland, Antarctica, the Norwegian coast, and wild Scotland. Her numerous visits to Svalbard led to her 2021 novel Cold Coast, and Robyn lives in Tasmania with a penguin biologist and a blue heeler. So thanks so much, Robyn. Sounds like you've had very interesting times.
Yes, and I could actually almost be in the Arctic at the moment because I'm looking out onto a Hobart's mountain, which is just covered in snow.
Oh, really?
Apparently, we've had the coldest temperatures since 1950 yesterday and today.
Oh, wow. Is that oh no, Mount Wellington, is it?
Yeah, that's right. Kanani, Mount Wellington.
Yeah, yep. I remember seeing it it had snow on it when I visited Hobart. Just wondering if you want to tell us a little bit about Cold Coast.
For sure. It centres on the life of a real woman whose name was Vonnie Voldstad, and she was a Norwegian woman who became the very first trapper and hunter to go to Svalbard, which is up in the high Arctic. It's way north of Norway, and this is back in 1932, at a time when the pelts of Arctic fox and polar bear were commercially exploited and valued, and that's what she was doing up there. And she was a pretty remarkable woman. She was a young widow. She lost her husband to Spanish influenza, and in that era, life would have been incredibly difficult as a single woman. But somehow or other, she actually managed to buy a taxi cab, and in 1930 became the town's very first taxi driver, which I think is remarkable in and of itself. But what would happen is she would ferry the trappers to and from the local beer hall when they came home from their trapping season. And probably after a few beers, she'd take them home, and during the ride, they'd share with her their stories of life in Svalbard as a trapper. And she became so inspired by that dream of that kind of wild freedom that she made it her mission to go there and become a trapper.
That's a great summary of the book. Thank you. Just wondering if there might be a little bit of the book you could read us.
Absolutely, I'd love to. In fact, I've just got this one paragraph. It's pretty short, but I hope that it sets the scene of what the inside of the hut might look like and smell like and feel like. So, of course, remembering that, they're up there hunting foxes and bears. The hut reeks of bear, sour and rotten. The chief, which is the name she gives to her trapping partner, Anders Satterdal, the chief sits behind her at the table, scraping blubber from skin, the pelt as expansive as carpet. The three dogs keep their eyes trained on Anders, then shift to her, anticipating whether cook or flayer will be the first to send a treat their way. A second bear, its face gruesome with shot, consumes the remainder of the floor, where it has been thawing for days. The bunks are the only corner of the room free of skin and blubber, dogs and chaos, the one part of the hut to maintain civility. On that they have agreed. She has to step over the bear to reach her bunk. She has to search it out with her foot if she gets up through the night. She circles it each time she tends the stove. She laughs aloud. Perhaps every home should have a 400-kilogram ice bear taking up its floor. The chief looks up from his work. Those who buy these skins have little notion.
No, thanks. That's great. And we've got quite a few people watching, which is really great. We've got some questions coming through already. Just if anyone joined a little bit later and didn't hear what I said at the start, if you do have a question for Robyn, please type it in comments and I'll read it out. And you all have a chance to win a copy of Cold Coast, thanks to Ultimo Press. So that's really great. Belinda wonders what sparked your interest in cold landscapes.
Well, maybe being born in Tasmania, I don't know where Belinda comes from, if Belinda's Australian or beyond Australia, but Tasmania has pretty chilly winters. But even as a kid, you know, I had this dream that I wanted to go to Antarctica, and the polar heroes of the early 1900s were, you know, just captivated my imagination. And I think probably more than the cold is the wildness, and somehow it's just kind of ended up that those wild places have been at either end of the planet and have been in cold latitudes.
Yeah, and I've got a couple of people asking similar questions. Both Patricia and Sharon wonder where the idea came for Cold Coast.
I've been working as a ship-based tour guide since the year 2000, and I started in the Antarctic on a tiny Russian ice-strengthened ship, and then that ship started doing voyages to the Arctic, and specifically to Svalbard and East Greenland. Svalbard's an archipelago made up of a number of islands, but the main island of the archipelago is called Spitsbergen. And Vonnie Voldstad worked in the southwest corner of Spitsbergen, and the first time I went to Svalbard, we visited this area, and I can remember on the ship, you know, we motored up this beautiful fjord, and at the end of this fjord was this massive mountain, and you could barely hear yourself speak because it was just filled with breeding seabirds and all of their squawks and cries. And right at the bottom of this mountain, so small you could easily have missed it, was this tiny little wooden cabin. And that wooden cabin, I later learned from our onboard historian, was used by Vonnie Voldstad. It was actually a satellite hut that they would go to from their main base, and that was the hut she used during her time up there, and that immediately piqued my interest. You know, the fact that a woman was doing this, what was regarded then and probably now as men's work, and you know, that got me asking those questions like, you know, how on earth did a woman in 1932 break into this male domain, and what was the experience like? Because in that area of Svalbard, there's 4 months of the polar night. The sun sets in October. It doesn't rise again until February. And I just wanted to know what was that experience like for Vonnie, and particularly, you know, what were the additional challenges for a woman of the day going up there? So that's what set me on that course of research.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. And Patricia's wondering if you chose the title yourself.
I did, and the title Svalbard is the name of the archipelago. It's a Norwegian term, and the English translation of Svalbard is Cold Coast, and that's where the name originates.
No, that's interesting too. And Jill wonders what you like to read yourself, and do you have a favourite genre? And I'm wondering if there's anything you might have been reading lately that you could recommend to us.
I really read a mix of stuff. I probably don't read crime so much.
Mm,
However, if you sat in our living room over the last 18 months, I've just become absolutely addicted to Nordic noir.
mm,
And I'm a binge watcher, so it's really weird that I absolutely love those kinds of crime, that crime genre, but it
yeah.
isn't something I generally read. I read a whole mix of stuff, and um, more recently, I've read. Um, Let me just see if I can just grab it. Here we go. I just read this
Oh
really beautiful
yes,
book.
yeah.
Have
It's a
do you guys know
wonderful.
it?
I've read it and interviewed the author. It's a wonderful book, isn't it?
It's really
Mm,
wonderful. And
yeah.
then more recently, I read a collection of short stories called Smokehouse
Mm,
by Australian author Melissa Manning, and that was actually set in around Hobart. But
okay.
it's the most
Mm,
extraordinary collection of short fiction that I've read
mm.
for a long, long time. And let me think, I'm just about to start on a novel called Love and Virtue.
Oh yes,
Um,
I've heard
yeah,
that,
so
but I
a bit
haven't.
of a mix.
Yeah, no, they're good recommendations there. Wendy says she finds Antarctica very interesting and has read quite a bit about it and wonders what takes you back year after year to such a harsh but extraordinary place.
As I mentioned, I've been lucky enough to be a tour guide, and I've been doing that for well over 20 years now, or at least until COVID um, came along.
Mm,
But my partner is a penguin and seabird biologist, and
mm.
I've worked as his field assistant in Antarctica.
Oh,
And in fact, we
interesting.
spent a whole year pretty much out on the sea ice studying emperor penguins. And, I regard that as probably the best year of my life, that experience. And what I find with the voyages that are tourist voyages is, we'll go back to favourite spots again and again,
Mm,
but every time we go, they're different. And it might be that it's a different part of the season. It may be that the weather is different. And so, suddenly
mm,
something's doused in snow that last time you were there, it was bathed in sunshine. And there's always something kind of new to experience. So
mm.
I just feel energized by that environment. And other people have said to me, oh, don't you get sort of sick of going back? And I
Mm,
never have. In fact, I love that feeling of being familiar with a place.
mm, mm. And Sharon wonders how much research you did for your latest book.
Sharon, I did a shitload of research.
Yeah.
I reckon I did probably a year all up, and I was lucky enough to get a grant from the Australia Council of the Arts,
Mm,
and that enabled me to travel up to northern Norway to a small town called Tromsø, which is where Vonnie Boldstad lived as a young adult and where she drove a taxi. And I just spent, a couple of weeks just wandering the streets and going to that
mm,
local beer hall where the trappers once went,
mm,
and just, getting the feel of the place. But in addition, Tromsø has an absolutely remarkable polar museum. And a big part of it is dedicated to trappers and the hunting era and so on. So I spent days and days in there just poring over exhibitions, and probably, there was a lot of kind of traditional reading of old texts and so on. But one of the most valuable parts of the research was Bonnie Voldstad herself had a memoir published in 1956. Of course,
mm,
it's, out of print. And I managed through a library document delivery service to obtain a copy of that. It took about 6 months. And then it took a couple more months for me to get it
mm,
translated from Norwegian to English. And that was so valuable because it there wasn't a lot in there about feelings and thoughts and fears and all of those kind of things. I wish there had been, but it was this really crystal clear window into the day-to-day practicalities of being a trapper, and that really provided the scaffolding for the novel. So yeah, the research was a really big component of it.
Yeah, I can imagine. Yeah. And is there anything that you found in your research that like really surprised you that may not be in your book or?
Um, well, there's a couple of things that surprised me, which would be spoilers if I
Yeah.
said them, because they
Yeah.
are in the book. But you know, Vonnie's, she was just a very young woman in her 20s when her husband died of Spanish influenza. And of course, you know, I did the research on that and looked at the statistics and blah, blah, blah. But it wasn't until COVID affected all our lives that I really started to think more deeply about what the mood of the world must have been in 1919, at a time when not as much was known about viruses and transmissions, and yet, you know, Spanish influenza, the death toll worldwide was something like 50 million, as opposed to COVID is currently 5 million. You know, and you just, I actually rewrote, there's not a huge amount in the book about Spanish influenza, but the little bit there is, I sat down and rewrote with a whole new kind of perspective on it.
Yeah, that is very interesting. Jill's wondering if you've always wanted to be an author.
That's a great question, Jill. When no, and I came to writing quite late, because when I was of an age where most people are sort of finishing school and going to uni, I had no interest in going to uni at all, and I didn't know what I wanted to do, and I was a bit artistic, and I enjoyed writing, but, you know, I never even imagined there could be a career in writing. And it wasn't until I was in my 30s and I decided I was going to go to university and study. And I had this thing that I wanted to become a speech pathologist. And so I got into speech pathology, which was pretty competitive. And by the end of the first year, I realised that I was less interested in like the diagnostics of speech pathology as the stories of what say it is to be in the world with a voice disorder, or you know, something affecting your speech. And I realised that pathway wasn't for me, and almost out of desperation, I thought, well, what am I going to do now, you know? And I switched to an arts degree, and luckily for me, I did a creative writing unit in that first year, and I had a fantastic tutor. And in fact, one of my tutors one year was Elizabeth Jolly, you know, and that was wonderful. And I just fell in love with writing, still not thinking there could ever be a career in it. But, you know, that study took me on to do a master's and then a PhD, and that was the start of the publishing side of things.
And how hard or easy was it for you to get that first book published?
It was actually a novel. It was The Nature of Ice, which is my first published novel, which I did as part of my PhD. And it's a novel that's set in the Antarctic. And, you know, I sent it off without much sort of understanding even of how difficult it was. And Alan and Unwin, you know, I was so lucky that they took it up, and they worked with me a lot on developing that novel. And so, you know, it was many, many, many months of waiting to see if someone would accept it. So I feel like it was a stroke of good fortune, really.
And Kelly says you have such unique settings. Have you chosen your next one?
Kelly, I think all of my long fiction has a really has a place in nature. And weirdly enough, all of my short fiction is usually set in an urban setting.
Oh,
But
okay.
I think for my next novel, I've got this kernel of an idea, and I'm almost too frightened to start exploring it in case it doesn't work out. But if it does work out, it's most definitely set in a natural place, and probably a cold place.
Yeah. And Belinda wonders if there's something you could share with us that surprised you about Antarctica.
Where on my very first trip to Antarctica, which actually was as a passenger on a small tourist ship, I was expecting that the wildlife, the penguins, the seals, that would be that would be it. That would be the absolute highlight. And of course, it is a huge highlight. But I never expected the impact that the ice had on me, and that it still has on me to this day. And what I mean by that is, in our lives, we're so distracted, and we're hardly ever living in the moment. There's so much happening, whatever it is. But what I find when I'm in Antarctica or the Arctic and I'm around icebergs is I feel like it's a meditation. And I just feel it's probably the one moment in my life where I'm fully in that moment, and I feel kind of liberated from it. So I think the ice was a big surprise to me, and no one can prepare you for how beautiful it is.
And Fran wonders if you collect descriptions of moments as you see, hear, and feel them. So, what she said that she means reflect on the moment and then maybe write bits up about it.
That's a good question, Fran. I'm trying to think what I do. I probably do a mix of things, but one thing I do tend to do is take a lot of photos. And these days I just, take photos with my phone. And when I'm writing a scene or trying to get myself into that frame of mind, I'll often have photos open on my computer. And in some cases, it will bring back the feeling that I felt when I was in that moment. And that often helps me. It offers a pathway into that descriptive language.
And what do you hope that readers will love about your books?
Well, probably, mentioning the elephant in the room or the polar bear in the room, it is a book about a woman who traps and hunts. And of course, inevitably, part of the novel is about, the act of killing animals. And I know what I've tried to do is to be true to the 1930s mindset toward animals and pelts and that commercial exploitation, knowing that, if the book was published, a contemporary reader might find that quite repugnant. But I really hope what readers will get out of it is, well, one, that they'll love Bonnie Voldstad and admire a woman an ordinary woman who achieved an extraordinary life, but that the experience Bonnie had and her own passion for the Arctic and this very lightly trodden, these lightly trodden footsteps that those trappers led, I hope that people will really get a really deep feeling for the Arctic, which is a place I feel so strongly about, and which is just at this critical point, and maybe just develop some of those same feelings for it.
And Sharon wonders if you have a writing routine.
Yeah, pretty much, Sharon. I'm pretty disciplined, which isn't to say I'm always good at it, but I really do try and regard it as a full-time job. And what I've learned is that if I sit down or if I decide I'm going to wait for inspiration and not start writing until that happens, I'd probably stop on page 3 and I wouldn't get any further. So I just begin my day, and I probably start writing at about 8:30 or 9, and just write. I keep a sort of business day almost. And when it gets to 5 o'clock, if I'm going really well, I'll keep going, and if I'm not, I won't. Or if I'm having an absolutely crap day, I'll give it up after a couple of hours. But I really do try and maintain just sitting down at my computer, and even if I don't write a lot that day, I'm looking back over my notes and thinking about things or reviewing the work I've done yesterday.
And do you have a favourite place to write?
I've kind of discovered over the years that, I've got my little office here, and I've had varying offices. They've always been at home generally. But I've found that there's no correlation between having a fancy office and writing any better than having the most confined space you can imagine. So I'm probably a lot less kind of fussy about, how that space has to look than I once was.
And do you have could you tell us what you find is the most difficult part of the writing process?
I think getting into the story, I sort of know that it's going to take a lot of writing for the story to start gaining momentum, and then to have to go back and often cut out that first part because it's no longer fits. And in facing a new work, it's like that marathon of, God, I'm about to do all this work, and I'm going to probably the first 4 months of it won't even see the light of day. So I think that side of it's difficult. And maybe, I'm sure other writers have said this, just sort of believing in yourself. It's a pretty lonely occupation, and it's a pretty unhealthy occupation, so sedentary and solitary. And it's easy to lose confidence, self-confidence. And, there's so many amazing writers, Jackie, as you know. There's just so many marvellous writers. And, you read someone else's work and it's just fantastic, and you sort of, And so, I think it's a perpetual struggle with hoping that you're good enough.
Yeah, so some self-doubt and do you have like a group of writer friends or that you catch up with, or to share ideas off with, or encourage each other?
Yes, I do. We no longer all live in the same state, and I spend a lot of my life in WA, and I've got colleagues and very good friends who are wonderful writers, but also trusted readers. And I'm quite judicious about sharing my work because it's a big ask to have someone review your work, but it's just invaluable. And so I'm lucky enough to have a handful of good writing friends who are willing to, we share one another's work and offer one another candid feedback, and that's just invaluable.
Yeah, that's great. And do you have any advice that you give to a new writer?
Well, just sort of touching on that idea of a writing community, I think if you can form a group, whether it's just you and one other person, but form a group of people where you do decide, well, okay, we're going to have this schedule, we're going to meet once a month or whatever it is, and review one another's work. I think that, one, it keeps you honest in terms of a deadline, and it often gives you the inspiration and encouragement and gives you the focus on how you might develop your work. So I often think writing is a really collaborative process, and I'd always encourage an emerging writer to think about ways that they can make that happen.
No, thanks. That's great advice. And thanks so much for joining us. It's been great chatting to you. Just wondering if you can let people know, how can they keep up to date with what's happening with your writing?
Well, I'm on Instagram. My Instagram address is RC for Carolyn, RC Mundy. And yeah, I'm on LinkedIn as well. So yeah, I'd love to interact with anyone who's here tonight, and I'm very happy to answer any other questions. Just direct message me on that, and that would be fantastic.
Yeah, no, thanks so much. Been great chatting to you, and thanks to everyone who joined in. We had some great questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Jackie.
And just want to thank Ultimo Press as well. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye.